So today what I want to do is I want to do a comparison of the Beelink SER5 mini PC with the Ryzen 5 5560U with the TRIGKEY Ryzen 5 5500U mini PC. Now this version of the SRE5 is no longer available. It got replaced with the version with the 5500U, which would make the point of this video a little irrelevant except for the fact that there are systems out there that still are rocking the Ryzen 5 5560U, as you can see right here. And what that means is that there is at least some relevancy to getting a comparison of these two systems that seem to be almost identical in terms of design. I'm pretty convinced that TRIGKEY is just using either the same manufacturer or TRIGKEY is just a sub-brand of Beelink, because everything about the way these are designed is pretty much identical to each other. Now, in terms of how these CPUs perform, in Cinebench, the Ryzen 5 5500U in the TRIGKEY gives us a score of 7,137, while the Ryzen 5 5560U ends up giving us a score of 7,566. So there is a difference here, though not a substantial one. In general, this makes sense because the Ryzen 5 5560U is based off of Zen 3, while the 5500U is on Zen 2. So we get some improvements in clock speeds as well as an increase in IPC, and that pretty much ends up making up for the vast majority of the increase in terms of the CPU performance. First up, we're taking a look at Sleeping Dogs running at 1080p with the medium graphics settings. Now you can see here that there is a pretty noticeable difference between the two systems here. Surprisingly though, the 5500U, even though it has one more GPU core, actually came out performing lower in terms of an overall average compared to the 5560U, but the 1% lows were pretty noticeably higher as well. Neither one of them was giving a bad experience, and both will more than satisfy you. But this is one of the few actual leads that the 5560U ends up getting here. In most other cases, you're going to actually find it trailing behind the 5500U, and this of course makes sense because of the GPU core difference here as well as the clock speed difference. The biggest advantage that the 5560U has is the fact that it is just on a newer architecture, so it has a higher IPC, so better CPU performance, but in most titles it's just going to be the iGPU that ends up being the limiting factor. As you can see here with Ghost Recon Wildlands, there is a pretty noticeable gap in terms of the performance that we get out of the 5500U versus the 5560U. Now in a game like this, it's not really going to be that different in terms of making it a playable experience or not. Neither one is going to be a particularly enjoyable time, but with these lower FPS, being able to squeeze out 1 or 2 more frames can actually make a difference in terms of making things more playable. As you can see here with Batman Arkham Knight running at the lowest in-game graphics settings, the difference between the two is not really that noticeable. They're a lot closer to each other, but again, at these lower FPS, that 1 to 2 FPS difference can make playing the game just slightly more enjoyable. In this case though, they are very, very similar to each other. And where both of these chips really seem to thrive is in older titles that you just are barely trying to get to right now. Though even in that situation, and as you can see here with Resident Evil 5 running with its maximum graphics settings and the AA set to 8 times, there is a gap here between the 5500U and the 5560U. But if you just drop the AA from 8 down to 4, you'll make up more than the difference in FPS, and there is no visual difference. So in older titles, you're still going to be able to play perfectly fine on both chips. One of the main differences with older titles is just the fact that you might actually have to lower the graphics settings a little bit. Here you can see Bioshock Infinite running with the very high graphics settings. And for the 5560U, I would really just recommend dropping down to medium, and that will more than make up for any difference in terms of FPS. So it's not like the lower GPU core count here bars you from playing a lot of games. It might just change what graphic settings you will and won't be able to use. But in general, most things are still going to get you a playable FPS experience. It's just you're getting a little bit closer towards the edge of what is considered playable or not. As you can see here, Shadow of Mordor with the lowest in-game graphics settings still perfectly playable, though there is a distinct gap in comparison to the 5500U. And that really is always just coming down to the iGPU. It's really just older titles that start to flex the capabilities of hardware like this. Being able to play a game like Grid 2 at the high graphics settings and get this kind of FPS is really, really nice. You're able to get better visual quality and performance than the consoles that were out at the time that people were playing most of these games at. So you pretty much get to have the remastered experience without having to shell out a lot of money for new hardware. Though again, the higher graphics settings might be out of the reach of the 5560U, as you can see here with the Tomb Raider reboot running at the high graphics settings, puts the FPS at a point where you might just consider going down to medium and get that 60 FPS average. That said, it's not completely set in stone that the 5500U is just going to perform better all the time. As you can see here with Mountain Blade 2 Bannerlord, the 5560U actually managed to get a pretty sizable lead over the 5500U in this title, both in terms of the FPS average and more crucially in the 1% lows. This means that there is a pretty major difference in terms of how both of them feel to play, and the 5560U makes a pretty meaningful difference here, and it all just comes down to that CPU being all around better. For a title like this, it really seems to work out. And another title that actually showed a pretty meaningful lead for the 5560U was Rainbow Six Siege, where the 5500U pretty much was struggling to get anywhere near a 60 FPS average, and the 1% lows were pretty noticeably below that. The 5560U is actually able to get a above 60 FPS average with 1% lows that are just slightly under that 60, which means there is a pretty drastic difference in terms of smoothness between the two here. The 5560U is just noticeably better. But I have to stress that this is not going to be the result all the time, and in most cases it's just going to be the iGPU that is the problem. As you can see here with the Mafia 2 Definitive Edition built-in benchmark, again the 5560U falls behind the 5500U, and this is the last game that I tested here, but in general the 5500U was just coming out ahead except for those more CPU demanding situations. So after all that, you're probably wondering, well, what is the best option within this price category? Because there are a variety of different chips that are very close to each other within this price point. And honestly, I feel like the 5560U is kind of in an awkward spot, specifically because the iGPU is just weaker than everyone else's. Its biggest advantage is the fact that it has those Zen 3 based CPU cores, so if you know what you're going to be doing is very CPU dependent, it's not a bad option. But with that said, though, I do think that in general, you are better off going with the 5500U. It seems to be a better all-arounder. And as you saw with the Ace Magician here, unless you're going to be running a system that you want to be extremely low power, the 5500U in the TRIGKEY here is just an overall better option. But I'll catch you in the next one.